This week, for our tour of the National Park Service, for the purposes of hooking together location, food, and time period, I'm taking a little detour outside of the NPS and veering into a locally managed site. We enter the state I have at times called my nemesis, Indiana. I'll just say the most prominent aspect of this uneasy relationship involves a spider bite. Enough said. Anyway, at this point in our history, this is not a state, but rather a portion of the Northwest Territory, and the particular site of interest is Fort Wayne, the American fort built in 1794, so it falls right in the middle of our time period, and the fact that it is a frontier fort places it in the crosshairs of the question of consumption of wild game during this period of war and adventure. Built as part of the continued war with the British after the Treaty of Paris in 1783, where the Northwest Territories were, at least on paper, ceded to the United States. But on land, the British refused to vacate that wedge of land south of the Great Lakes and north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. Further, they took advantage of the present political infighting of the local tribes and supported those most willing to push against the Americans seeking to cross the Appalachian Mountains and settle in the rich riverlands currently hunted and farmed by the Shawnee, Lenape, Miami, Wabash, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Ojibwe, Huron, and others. The main fort the British held, Fort Detroit, would become a major flashpoint in the War of 1812, and its continued existence after the Treaty of Paris was the impetus for the construction of the Indiana Fort Wayne. By the end of the War of 1812, original Fort Wayne had been abandoned, and a new Fort Wayne near Detroit was constructed, and that still exists and is run by, guess who, the National Park Service. While the one I'm talking about is a 1976 reconstruction about a quarter mile from its original site in Fort Wayne, Indiana. So, back to the reason for original Fort Wayne. The poorly paid, poorly supplied, and frankly poorly trained rabble that passed for the American Frontier Army had regularly been soundly flattened by the British and their native allies. General Mad Anthony Wayne turned this trend around and directed the construction of a fort on the capital of the pan-tribal Northwestern Confederacy, Kekionaga. This is the place that the Americans planned to regroup and figure out how to be a proper expansionist power. And after all, it was also already a confluence of trade, as it was sited at the junction of the St. Mary's, St. Joseph, and Maumee rivers. And small stockades and forts had already been sited there by the French and some fur companies. As an outpost far from regular supply routes, at different times wild game would have played important, symbolic, and even essential roles in the fort supplies. So a perfect specimen to visit if the crossroads of war, adventure, and wild game interests you. There's also a chance to see a pretty decent reconstruction of 18th century fort architecture, a large selection of recreated uniforms, firearms, socks, and spats, Hudson's Bay blanket coats, Voyager caps, and my favorite, 18th century military open hearth cookery and housekeeping for and by both enlisted men, officers, and the women that were part of the campaign community, and all the laundry and layers of complexity that went into that. So if you find yourself in the riverlands of America's old Northwest Territory, as opposed to my end of the world, the Pacific Northwest, do swing by the old fort at Fort Wayne, and I'll toss their website in the show notes. Episode 111, Wild Game for War and Adventure. Hello and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll finally be looking at the roles wild game played in our time of war and adventure, how it helped, when it was a symbol of privilege, and how it could offer false hope, and when it flat out caused problems. To dig into all that and more, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that for this episode particularly, I am indebted to all the scholarly work that has gone into making the notes and records from the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery accessible. While wild game played roles in lots of war and adventure, few of those endeavors have the sort of documentary focus that this expedition did. Military installments are more focused on what was supposed to happen, and while some recorded shortfalls, 18th century military documentation rarely gets into the nitty-gritty of how things actually happened when it came to supplies, especially supplementary supplies. And unlike the Corps of Discovery, they rarely would have given a thought to a possible future historian being interested in culinary details. And most trail breakers, long hunters, fur trappers, and families carving out a home on the wild frontier had other concerns than journal keeping. And even then it was likely to contain things like accounts of nails and farming plans. But an adventure more or less dedicated to noticing stuff and recording it, and then most of the stuff wasn't lost before the Library of Congress became a serious thing? Oh well, that is rather incredible. The fact that I can reach so much of it without having to journey to the original repository or to the locations of monographs written up on it, that is simply a mind-boggling miracle. Okay, so enough waxing ecstatic about how research has changed since I was a tiny child. Let's talk wild game for those on the move in baby America. There is a big problem with fresh meat. It goes bad. So while hunting peoples first had to solve the problem of getting meat, the very second problem was making the meat last until it could all be eaten. And then, of course, some of it gets saved for when there wasn't any other food. As I've written, different versions of this problem were solved in better and worse ways over the last couple thousand years or so. Smoking, salting, pickling, freezing, freeze-drying, and on occasion combinations of some of the above. But no matter how you cut it, at some point you can't pack all the meat one is going to need for all time, or for an entire long journey. There's a great meandering examination of the tyranny of wagons, first described by the fabulously practical blog, A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, and then taken to its most ridiculous conclusion as single donkey physics by the Substack, Maximum Effort, Minimum Reward. Basically, you can only carry so much food and supplies with you on your back and then in donkey carts until no matter how many carts and donkeys and add-ons, all the extra space will always end up being more donkey food. The links to these seriously fabulous dives into logistical theory are in the show notes. Because when you get down to it, food is heavy, and the stuff packed in barrels is even heavier, and that's a lot of what armies and expeditions were eating out of. I mean, episode 109, right? So there's the option of meat on the hoof. I mean, it carries itself. But before you get to thinking an army should just have herds of cows, either on the move or at their forts, many a cow herd dairymaid and quite a few pre-industrial soldiers would like a word. And that's before we even get to the 19th century cowboy or the 21st century large animal vet. Herds of food animals are not made for orderly movements at anything like a timely pace, especially not if you want to eat them. Oh yeah, and everyone, not just you, sees them as a giant traveling meal. So between just getting them to the next stop and protecting them from every large predator you pass by, including other humans, that's a huge job and really interferes with the war part of the job. Also, cows on the move, they gotta drink and they gotta eat. And if you're keeping them in a fort, you gotta feed them somehow. Anyway, keeping herds of cows is a farmer's job, not one soldiers have ever done particularly well. So a BYO beef herd was not on. Nor sheep, nor pigs, nor goats, nor chickens. Chickens on a boat in a cage, yes. Chickens on the march, not so much. But what were the realities of going hunting for meat on the wing or the hoof? Or going fishing for it? Well, let's take a look. And for simplicity's sake, I'll start with the army. If one was at a fort, fishing was definitely an option. Hooks could be carved or fashioned from scraps of lots of things, and since there were no video games and few letters from home to read or write, making line out of various materials was definitely a time filler many people took up. After all, much of the time at a fort was spent, well, just sitting around. Sure, there's housekeeping chores, chopping wood, making repairs, doing maintenance, packing cartridges, doing lookout and patrol, but there's still lots of downtime, and fishing was a great way to use it. After all, most forts in early America that were inhabited for any length of time were either right on a river or quite near one. But what about going out hunting for game? Well, if one was a dab hand at setting snares or hunting small game with spears, then rabbits or hares or prairie grouse and any other small game on the ground might be available to the enlisted, to officers, and even to some accompanying women. But anything that needed to be shot, well, that was for officers only, most of the time. In the Army's guns and the Army's ammunition belong to the Army, and enlisted men were not allowed to have personal weapons. Practical and even hunting knives wouldn't have counted as weapons. But swords, pistols, and long guns, absolutely not allowed. So if one wanted to go shooting for game, one needed to be an officer and have one's own firearm, as well as the ammunition and the time to engage in such an activity, which many of them actually did. Officers going out for shooting parties out of a fort, or even from a long-standing camp mid-March, was a pretty common exercise. And of course, since officers usually had servants, including cooks, they usually had someone to do all the time-consuming work of turning that fresh kill into actual food. But large game for the enlisted man, beyond the occasional fish or rabbit, that was uncommon. There would, of course, be times when promised barrels of salt pork and salt fish didn't show up in the promised numbers. On those occasions, the best shots in the company might go out with officers in a hunting party to scare up provisions. But this was not common and was pretty risky as a supply strategy. After all, just how many deer or elk or even bison did you need to come back with to feed 50 or 100 or 200 fort inhabitants? And how did you even get that many back to the fort? Even if everyone had horses, there is a limit of how much of the fresh kill they could carry back, and more than one horse has been known to refuse that job. So wild game could feed a fort in a pinch, but not for sustained periods of time and not as a dependable strategy. I mean, let's look back at what happened to those early guys at James Fort, soon to be Jamestown. When they got there, they were writing about giant herds of 200 deer hanging out right by the fort, and several months later, they were eating their dogs. And on the march, well, not at all. There's no time for fishing, and humans are noisy and stinky, especially when traveling in war parties. So no game is going to hang around to get caught. And just think about the problem of groups of guys wandering off into the woods or prairie to hunt for supper. Nobody's even wearing blaze orange. The prospect of accidentally shooting the camp or another hunting party is just too high. And the getting of the game back to camp, and how much game would even need to be taken down to feed the camp. Same questions with the same problematic answers are still there. So no wild game on the active march. So it boils down to, if one is in the Army, is there wild game for war and adventure? Not much, and mostly just as fun for the officers. But when it comes to adventure, does the game change? Yes, it does. There are sort of three groups of adventurers at this point. The profit-driven solo hunters, though some guys worked in pairs or small groups, funded expeditions like Lewis and Clark, and settlers or pioneers. The profit-driven solo hunter generally did eat quite a bit of wild game, though the voyageurs, who were specifically after fur, once the venture became streamlined and more mercenary than how it had started out, many of them, while traveling to their hunting spots, would subsist on a diet of mainly cornmeal and lard, which left them in terrible shape upon arrival and is part of what helped set up the Pemmican Wars when they discovered how much better that was as a travel food. And since they were specifically after fur-bearing animals, which tend not to be particularly tasty, except reportedly the fatty tails of beavers, they were so busy generating their piles of furs, they didn't have time to hunt for food animals much. So they would pack in their not particularly nutritious food. But the long hunters, men further south in the woodlands of the American colonies, they were generally after deer skins. And, well, deer are known to be tasty. But, like the fur hunters up north, this was not a leisurely pursuit, or even one that left much time for animal processing beyond removing the hide. And after all, why carry around a bunch of meat that's in the process of rotting when all the profits are in the skins? So while the long hunters regularly had access to large amounts of deer meat, most of it was left on the forest floors to be eaten by all manner of carrion eaters, foxes, wolves, bears, and weasels of various descriptions, as well as the ubiquitous turkey buzzards that continue to grace the highways of our nation's east and south. Long hunters would almost always take the tongue, for it was easy to cook, it had no bones, and it was easy to smoke for slightly longer keeping. Another common choice was the backstrap, a muscle that equates more or less to the tenderloin in a cow. It's easy to separate, and it isn't wrapped around any bones. And also, as a stabilizing muscle, it's generally less tough and stringy than more active muscles. So hundreds of pounds of food would just be left, and these guys would take the skins and leave the rest to rot. This incidentally cut into the deer population and were part of what led to the early attempts at hunting seasons. But it was also part of the multi-pronged strategies used to pressure natives to vacate the land the colonists and then the new Americans were dying to fill up with cows and pigs, and maybe a few sheep. The people on the road looking for a new place to set up home, settlers, pioneers, invaders, call them what you will, but these folks would eat some wild game to stretch the provisions they had brought. Some would also have pigs or cows or sheep or goats in tow, but these animals were for setting up a herd, not for eating on the way. Having some people in the party or paid guides or hunters to go out and get the meat animals was actually pretty common. But more than one party would depend too heavily on wild game and come to a bad end, or maybe they would just depend on generally the right amount of wild game adding to the pot and just have bad luck. I mean, just check out any of the versions of the game Oregon Trail. Of course, the later in the season and then the later in the 19th century, one was traveling out west, wherever west then happened to be, one had worse odds of finding enough game. Generally, the promise of wild game to get one through was never a sure thing and could end up as a fool's hope. But it could get a party to their destination and keep their bellies from touching their spines when they got the farm set up and finally multiplied a few cows. So in this case, wild game to support adventure? Absolutely. Just not with the glamour and plenty modern depictions would have one believe. Possum stew again? And so, we come at last to Lewis and Clark. First of all, despite the literal tons of supplies they began with, there was absolutely no way they could have packed enough food for this nearly 5,000-mile or almost 8,000-kilometer trek that took them the better part of 3 years. I mean, they packed quite a bit of the most compact food they knew, portable soup, but they ran out of that, and they ran out of salt. But they knew what they were about. A fair bit of the heavy supplies were lead canisters packed with gunpowder. The lead of the canisters could be turned into bullets as the gunpowder was used up. They also had spears and a true hunting dog who bagged a helpful number of rabbits, squirrels, and birds. And they were prepared to trade for provisions. Beads, knives, and cloth were far more compact than vegetable foods or even dried fish. As a crew of 30 people most of the time, a single large animal, elk or deer, say, would feed people well and would be mostly consumed well before too much rot set into the meat. The two problems with hunting game were getting a successful kill back to the camp and saving some for later. On more than one occasion, this was not possible. An elk killed too far from camp would either go bad or have to be cut up, and only part would make it back. The saving some for later was possibly the largest problem. There were portions of the trek where stopping and faffing about with hunting or even extensive food preparation was simply not an option. There are some territories where the local tribes were particularly unfriendly, and it was not healthy to hang about, much less hunt their game. And then there were other parts of the trail, like mountain passes, that had to be gotten over as quickly as possible. There was no food, there was no shelter, and terrible, and sometimes even deadly weather. And this, of course, is where running out of salt was an issue. Smoked meat keeps okay, but salted smoked meat, that keeps long enough to get over a seriously sloggy, soggy mountain pass that lacks any clear trail. Mostly. Well, just enough that no one starved to death. So that was the bit about why Lewis and Clark were making salt by the Pacific Ocean in the crummy Oregon winter weather. So they had a decent amount of food on their way out, but when Lewis and Clark were on their way home, it was an all-game diet. There was no food from home left at all. And to see more of the country, the party had split up and provided us with a misadventure that illustrates nicely why it was a terrible idea to have your hunters out hunting when you didn't know where everyone was. Or why hunting on the march with a large military company would have been a disastrous idea. When the 4-person party, led by Lewis, that had split off several months earlier, was closing in on the rendezvous spot at the confluence of 2 major rivers, one of the hunters in Clark's party mistook Lewis for an elk and shot him in the leg. Fortunately, they were nearly home and still had horses, so Lewis made it back. But see, I'm not making it up that hunting on the march, especially with firearms, was perilous, because more care than most people would take had to be taken. So accidents happened. But on these outfitted explorations, whether for science or land, river routes or bird paintings, because John James Audubon started his American wanderings in the 1820s, game played an important part in the provisioning. There was simply no way to bring enough food, and let's face it, there are no stores. So yes, in War and Adventure, there was wild game, but the larger the group, the less it could or did depend on wild game. Further, hunting a lot only made sense if the company was on the move. Stay in one place and you eat up all the animals. I mean, lots of people knew this, but the cow and pig eaters, those city folks and agricultural types, they kept having trouble with this idea. Next week, we move on from protein consumption habits of our war and adventure types and move on to beverages. Beer, cider, water, stronger stuff? Well, tune in and find out. But whatever it is, I'm sure I'm not spoiling anything by revealing that much of it was, not delicious. Thanks for listening. I'm also putting a link to a very readable recounting of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Undaunted Courage, in the show notes, as well as a link to the complete journals that were made available online in 2004 for the bicentennial of the journey. And there's also a link to the NPS interactive map so you can plan a trip following the whole trail, more or less. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. And holy moly, I can see the end of Season 3 from here. I am on Threads and Instagram the most, but I still peek at Twitter from time to time, and yes, you can leave me stuff on my Facebook page. So I'll see you over there too. Downloading the episodes helps me know you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. They let people know you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. And I continue to do a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength, and our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud. Crime. Lots of crime. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and all this information is available in the show description.